Okay, so imagine you're like way down a YouTube rabbit hole.
Right.
And you stumble upon this grainy video.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously transferred from like an old VHS tape.
I've been there.
And it's this documentary from 1995 about this mysterious project in Alaska.
Okay.
Called HAARP.
Hmm.
And what's so striking is how openly they discuss this technology.
Uh-huh.
Like, it could alter the world.
Yeah.
It's something that you really don't see anymore.
Yeah, it's really interesting how those discussions surrounding HAARP have become so much quieter over the years. Yeah. Almost like the topic itself has become...
Taboo.
Taboo, yeah.
And that alone makes you wonder if there's more to this story.
Absolutely.
So for today's deep dive, we're going back to 1995 with this documentary.
Right.
That focuses on what seems to be a pretty harmless antenna farm in the Alaskan wilderness.
Okay.
But at the time, some people were calling it a potential doomsday machine.
A doomsday machine.
Yeah. Quite a leap, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. That's definitely a strong statement.
Yeah.
It definitely grabbed people's attention back then. Theories about HAARP ranged from like controlling the weather to triggering earthquakes.
Wow.
It definitely captured the public imagination, maybe some anxieties as well.
So let's get into the specifics.
Right.
What exactly is HAARP?
Yeah.
And is there any reason to be concerned about its potential impact?
Good question.
Even all these years later.
The documentary starts by laying out the basics.
Right.
HAARP stands for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. John Heschner, the program manager at the time, described it as a research facility designed to study the ionosphere.
Now, before we go any further, let's break down what the ionosphere actually is. Yeah. It's not exactly a dinner table topic.
It's not the most common thing you hear about, no.
So I'm guessing some of our listeners might need a refresher.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so think of the ionosphere as this dynamic layer at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. It's constantly interacting with energy from the sun. And it's essential because it shields us from harmful radiation.
Okay.
You could even say it's like Earth's protective shield, like a force field.
So kind of like Earth's sunscreen.
Exactly.
But with much higher stakes.
Much higher stakes, for sure.
Right.
And one of the most visually stunning examples of the sun's interaction with the ionosphere is something most people have heard of. The Northern Lights.
Yeah.
Those dazzling light shows are created when charged particles from the sun collide with gases in the ionosphere.
So pretty but powerful.
Exactly. Beautiful, but with a lot of energy behind them.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right.
But how does HAARP fit into all of this?
Yeah, so HAARP basically transmits high-frequency radio waves into the ionosphere.
Okay.
You can imagine it like a focused beam of energy aimed at the sky.
Okay.
And this has a specific effect on the electrons in the ionosphere.
So they're basically shooting powerful radio waves.
That's right.
Up into this protective layer.
Yeah.
What happens when these waves hit the ionosphere? Does it cause any kind of disruption?
Well, the documentary describes it as punching a hole in the ionosphere.
Okay.
Though that's maybe a bit of a simplification.
Yeah.
What HAARP does is it temporarily energizes or superheats electrons in a small area of the ionosphere, causing them to disperse. The Air Force claimed that this manipulation was for research purposes, helping them understand and improve communication and surveillance systems, especially for satellites and radar technology.
So on the surface, it's about scientific research, national security.
Yeah.
But the documentary also features some people who are pretty skeptical.
That's right.
About the whole thing, right?
Absolutely.
It's here that the conversation starts to shift.
Yeah.
And we get a glimpse of why those old discussions about HAARP were so intense.
Right. One of the people they interview is Mark Farmer.
Oh, okay.
A journalist. Okay. And his research suggested that HAARP might have military applications beyond what they were publicly acknowledging.
Okay.
This is where things start to veer into the territory of those doomsday machine claims.
Okay. Now we're getting into the good stuff.
All right.
What kind of military applications are we talking about?
Right.
What could they potentially do with this technology that wasn't being disclosed?
Well, Farmer brought up something called Earth-penetrating tomography.
Whoa.
Which sounds pretty sci-fi.
Yeah, it does.
It's a technique that uses extremely low-frequency radio waves to essentially create an X-ray image of the Earth's subsurface.
Hold on, so you're saying they could use HAARP to see what's happening underground?
Exactly.
That's kind of creepy, isn't it?
A very powerful capability.
Right.
Yeah. Farmers' research indicated that HAARP could potentially be used for things like detecting hidden bunkers, underground nuclear facilities, or even listening in on enemy communications deep below the surface.
That does sound unnerving.
Yeah.
Especially if the technology is being used in ways that the public isn't fully aware of.
Yeah, that's one of the big concerns, right?
And it wasn't just Farmer who had concerns.
Exactly. The documentary also features Nick Begich, who had written a book about HAARP.
Okay.
And he was particularly worried about the technology being used for something called low-intensity conflict.
Low-intensity conflict?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
It refers to warfare that's below the threshold of conventional war.
Okay.
So things like psychological operations, sabotage, or disrupting infrastructure.
Okay.
He was concerned that HAARP could be used for these more subtle and perhaps deniable forms of conflict.
That's interesting.
What's interesting is that Begich pointed to a document from the 1980s that actually discussed using radio frequencies to disrupt human thinking.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it was a concept that was being explored.
That's crazy.
And the foreword for that document was written by, get this, Newt Gingrich.
Wow. Talk about a blast from the past.
Right.
That's a pretty unsettling thought.
It is.
It's making me think of all those sci-fi movies.
Yeah.
About mind control.
Right.
Yeah.
It does raise questions about unintended consequences. If you have the ability to manipulate a part of the atmosphere, like the ionosphere, what are the potential ripple effects, both in terms of the environment and potentially even on us?
Yeah.
And remember, all of this is being discussed openly in 1995.
Right.
Which makes you wonder why these conversations seem to have gone quiet since then.
It's like they were freely discussing this technology, and then suddenly it all went hush-hush.
Yeah, and that's a pattern we see with a lot of these controversial or potentially powerful technologies.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if the silence itself is more damaging than any potential threat the technology might actually pose.
Yeah. Right, because that lack of transparency breeds distrust.
Yeah.
And it fuels speculation.
And it makes it difficult to separate fact from fiction.
Exactly. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to unpack that a little bit more as we go through this documentary and really examine what was being said. What were the concerns back then and how have those concerns evolved? Or maybe even been addressed?
Right, because I have a feeling that a lot of those anxieties from back then are still relevant today.
Absolutely. I think they are. And they might even be amplified, the fact that there is this lack of open discussion now.
Exactly.
So we're going to delve into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
All right. Sounds good. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's get into it.
All right. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The documentary drops us off in 1997.
Right.
Just as HAARP becomes fully operational.
Right.
And it feels like a cliffhanger.
What happened next?
Right.
Did any of those predicted consequences actually come to pass?
Right.
Were there any noticeable effects on the environment? Did they start using HAARP for those more covert military applications?
You'd think there would be more information available.
You would.
Especially with the internet and everything.
Right.
But finding concrete details about HAARP's activities post-1997
Yeah.
is like searching for a needle in a digital haystack.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's almost as if the information has been deliberately scrubbed.
That very lack of easily accessible information adds another layer to this whole story, wouldn't you say?
It does.
I mean, a project that once generated so much public discussion, both scientific and just general curiosity, seems to have vanished from the spotlight.
It does make you wonder.
It does.
Is it just a case of the public losing interest? Or is there something more deliberate going on?
Right.
It's almost like the less information that's readily available, the more those initial anxieties and suspicions about HAARP's true purpose continue to linger.
Absolutely.
Right.
One thing we do know is that in 2015, HAARP was officially transferred from the Air Force to the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Okay.
This shift was presented as a way to make the facility available for more diverse research opportunities, moving away from its military associations.
So a shift from potentially secretive military applications
potentially
to open scientific research.
Right.
That sounds like a positive development.
It sounds like it on the surface.
Does that mean those earlier concerns about weaponization were unfounded?
It's not that simple.
Okay.
We have to remember that even in its early days, HAARP was officially a research program. The Air Force was always adamant that it was for scientific purposes. And even with the university now managing the facility, there's still the possibility of collaboration with government agencies. The lack of transparency about ongoing research at HAARP makes it difficult to know the extent of such collaborations, if any exist at all.
So it might just be a case of the research becoming more specialized.
It could be.
More academic.
Yeah.
And therefore less likely to be in the public eye.
Right.
But it's understandable why some people might still be suspicious.
Absolutely. For those who are already skeptical about HAARP's potential for weaponization, this lack of readily available information only fuels those concerns.
Right.
It feeds into the narrative that something is being hidden.
Yeah.
That the truth about HAARP is being suppressed.
It makes you wonder if the silence itself is more damaging than any potential threat the technology might actually pose.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Right.
By not being more transparent, they're almost inviting speculation and distrust.
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
We are, after all, talking about technology that can manipulate a part of our atmosphere.
Yeah, very important part.
A part of our planet that's crucial for life.
Right.
It's not unreasonable for people to want to know how it's being used.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what measures are in place to prevent any negative consequences.
Yeah, for sure.
Intended or unintended.
Right. It's about accountability.
Right.
And transparency.
Yeah.
It feels like we've reached a fork in the road here. On one hand, we have the potential benefits of HAARP.
Okay.
Studying the ionosphere, improving communication, maybe even advancing our understanding of space weather. But on the other hand, we have that lingering shadow of potential misuse.
Okay.
The possibility of weaponization and the risk of unintended consequences that could impact the whole planet.
So are we being overly cautious?
It's hard to say.
Or are we not being cautious enough?
Right, and without more transparency.
Right.
It's difficult to know which path HAARP is truly on.
Yeah.
This is where the lack of open discussion becomes a problem. If we can't talk about these issues openly, if we can't ask critical questions and demand accountability, then we're left with speculation and mistrust.
So what can we do about it?
That's the question, isn't it?
If people want to get to the bottom of this, where do we even begin?
Right.
How do we separate fact from fiction when it comes to a technology like HAARP?
It's not easy.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
How do we even begin to unravel a mystery like this?
Yeah.
It feels like we're dealing with a topic that intersects with, like, cutting-edge science, national security concerns, and a good dose of public skepticism.
Absolutely.
It's not an easy puzzle to solve.
No, it's definitely a complex issue.
Right.
And we can't just dismiss all the concerns about HAARP as mere conspiracy theories.
Right.
But we also can't let fear and speculation run wild without any real evidence.
So it's about finding that sweet spot.
Yeah.
That balance between healthy skepticism and informed inquiry.
Exactly.
How do we approach a topic like this without falling into those extremes?
I think a good starting point is to acknowledge the historical context. Okay.
The fact that there was so much open discussion about HAARP in the 1990s, and then it seemed to drop off the radar, naturally raises questions.
It does.
It's not unreasonable for people to wonder why that shift occurred.
Especially when you consider the potential implications of this technology.
For sure.
We're talking about the ability to manipulate a part of our planet's atmosphere, something that has a direct impact on our environment, and potentially even on our health.
Exactly. So while we should be wary of jumping to conclusions or embracing unfounded conspiracy theories, it's equally important to encourage critical thinking and to demand transparency from those who are developing and using these powerful technologies.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from this deep dive into HAARP, considering how much has changed or perhaps stayed the same since that 1995 documentary?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of staying informed and engaged.
Don't just accept the silence. If something piques your interest, dig a little deeper. Do your own research and draw your own conclusions.
It's almost like a call to action, isn't it?
It is.
Don't be afraid to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, and to demand accountability when it comes to powerful technologies that could have far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And remember, even though that 1995 documentary feels like a time capsule, the story of HAARP isn't over. The research continues, technology evolves. And those questions surrounding its purpose and potential impact are still relevant today.
And who knows what other advancements have been made since then.
Right.
Technologies that might have seemed like science fiction back in 1995 could be a reality today.
Absolutely.
It's a bit unnerving, but also incredibly fascinating.
It is. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
What other mysteries are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered? What other technologies are being developed that we might not even know about yet?
Well, I guess that's the beauty and sometimes the burden of living in a world of constant innovation.
For sure.
There's always something new to learn, something new to question, and something new to explore.
Absolutely.
And sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we make ourselves.
I completely agree with that.